Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry if you got a little blast of the Arctic Monkeys back at you there. It's freemanjack on TNS Radio, on tns.com, tnsradio.com, tnsradio.ning.com, and Scottish Sovereigns on the land.com. I hope everybody enjoyed World Fairy's broadcast this evening. Again, I hope you'll find it was informative, lively, and certainly engaging. Podcasts are available on the World Fairy's Weebly site. That's available under the podcast button. You'll also find a email form there, which, trust me, we do receive the emails from. So if you have need to get in touch with the World Fairy and you don't have Skype enabled, but you can use the TNS form there to send any messages that you've got for a request for advice from her. Okay, and of course all the rest of the team there. Let's not forget Nick and Neon. They're absolutely fabulous that they've dived in at this early stage and made the whole project seem very much more likely to come to some sort of fruition. Again, not to belittle the backroom lads there with the likes of Dubs and Co working on the website. Okay, well this is this is a show that I've been encouraged to do, I suppose. Possibly, I don't know if brave is quite the right word, really. Possibly one of the most risky shows that I've ever chosen to attempt. But in speaking to Vin privately, there have been times in my year on TNS where I have cried out of the airwaves before a show, usually at the last minute. I was suffering from internet problems, so I don't think for 1 minute that every time I'm not on the mic it's because some calamity has overtaken me. But I would use the gammy internet as an excuse in order that I need not admit in public that I was still suffering from the various attributes of the epilepsy that I've had since childhood. And in talking about Vin to this about this with Vin privately, he mentioned that he has been contacted many times by people just with expressing gratitude that I should be bringing subjects like epilepsy and mental health issues to the fore and discussing them from the perspective of a sufferer, a recoverer, a survivor. I don't know quite which terminology I'd like to use for myself. I certainly don't consider myself as suffering from epilepsy in any way, shape or form. To many degrees, it has been what has formulated it's been the forge of my intellect, I suppose. The realities that have been presented to me through my epilepsy have been so at odds with the realities that most people experience that it has forced me, in order to be able to make a head or tail of the world in which I live, to examine areas of science and of metaphysics that would normally just simply not need to be in anybody else's consideration. So perhaps, this is what pushes my envelope. Yes, and as far as a brave show, well, right now my ears are hissing like a badly wound, badly wired amplifier. And it's entirely possible that while describing this situation, it's entirely possible that I may induce a fit, or at the very least some degree of petty malalter, which will take me away from the mic, in which case I do apologise in advance. I'm not feeling too bad. This is essentially the consequence I don't even know if I can do this. I have been going like the clappers of late, not giving myself time in the day for sleep or for anything else, particularly self-oriented, I suppose. And as a result, I find that my body tends to throw out the anchor, slam on the handbrake, force me physically into some kind of state of stasis, possibly as some kind of a harm limitation, sort of automation, I suppose. I am incredibly hyper. My boy has inherited my attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, I believe they describe it as today. Hyperactivity is probably a much better description of it, because that really does kind of sum it up. The inability to rest being the major function of hyperactivity. It's like being a manic depressive without the depressive. Thanks, love. Sorry, I'm being delivered a cup of tea by my blonde assistant. Busty blonde.
Yeah, really. Look just like that, mate.
Don't believe the hype. Oh, hot sweet tea, my salvation. Okay, it may even be advisable for anybody that does suffer from epilepsy or faints, just to exercise caution with this show. You know what I mean? I really don't want to be triggering anything in anybody. So you know what I mean? You've always got the chance to catch this on podcast and maybe catch up with it if you feel, you know what I mean, confident enough to at some point. Because this is again, this is largely a obviously there are people that are born with congenital epilepsy. There are others that receive epilepsy through the birthing process, through the kind of brutality of forceps birth and the likes. There are others that end up with epilepsy because of things like car accidents, head injuries, and the likes. And I'm not in any way attempting to describe any of those situations. I suspect that I probably was born with a genetic propensity towards epilepsy, but it's my assertion that that propensity, the trigger switch for that propensity was stress, and to some degrees trauma, although my life as a child was never hugely traumatic. It wasn't particularly comfortable and was at times incredibly traumatic. So although it wasn't a hideous childhood, it was dotted with some fairly hideous events. These manifest themselves in an anxiety disorder that they now in DSM you'd hear it described as post-traumatic stress disorder. It's the sort of things that soldiers come back from the battlefield with. It's essentially the adrenaline gland has gone into such overactivity that I think you become hypoadrenal, it's described as. And this essentially means that where your adrenaline gland would normally only secrete adrenaline in large quantities suddenly to facilitate the fight or flight response and enable you to run a lot faster than you normally would if being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. Abstracted into the modern society and into the pressures of modern society, that fight or flight response can become this kind of hyper adrenality, where essentially your adrenal gland becomes so overstimulated that it essentially gets left in the on position, and you are left essentially dwelling in this realm of the permanently hypervigilant. Essentially, your body thinks that you're about to be eaten at any minute by a tiger. And your physical responses are essentially matched by this. And in that hypervigilant state, it doesn't take a great deal of pushing from the world to trigger the cascade that leads into full-blown epilepsy. Alright, the cascade. I mean, this is really kind of where it's at, the actual function, the actual thing that is epilepsy. And it would appear that in these hypervigilant states, or in the case of the brain damaged epileptic, erroneous synaptic signals. So imagine the computer as a huge network, and signals are normally passed around it at a ordered rhythmic rate. In the epileptic, this either erroneeous error signal, or in the presence of adrenaline, this hypervigilant over-amplification of the nerve responses becomes like a feedback on a live microphone in a hall where initially the feedback may come as simply an echo, a repeat of the signal being repeated back through the microphone from the speakers. And if this is allowed to continue, if nobody steps in and lowers the microphone level, this will simply continue to feed itself back into the loop and get louder and more persistent. And this is essentially what happens with these erroneous synaptic messages. They begin as a very subtle undercurrent of excess, of synaptic excess, and this is sensed by the epileptic as various erroneous, uncoordinated nerve messages, often wet patches. You feel like you've got water on you suddenly, or hot patches, or very, very cold patches, strange sensations, streaming sensations, almost like you're melting, usually accompanied by some degree of dimming of the vision. Whistling in the ears, dimming of the ears, sounds tending to grow more distant, less distinct. You begin to lose the ability to maintain conversation. You lose the thread. You can't follow what people are trying to say to you. Their words become randomly received, and you can't seem to reconstruct their sentence out of the sort of piecemeal of the sentence that you've actually understood. And so, like I say, if nothing intercedes, if you can't manage your environment, and this is something that is key for me, is that I suffer from very, very few fits because I micromanage my environment. If I'm not entirely confident that I'm okay, I will make sure that the children are well behaved, that I am in a comfortable place, that I am sitting or laying down, that there's no loud sounds, bright lights, sudden shocks. I will do everything in my power to focus on the reduction of the sensation. Anything that you perceive as a reduction in the sensation, you pursue. Anything that tends to stimulate these sensations, anything that tends to stimulate these sensations, you try to avoid. If you're very, very lucky, like I am most of the time, you manage to find an environment where you feel safe, can get yourself into some version of the recovery position and begin to manage those sensory inputs. And again, once you understand the actual function of this kind of synaptic discharge, of this cascade of erroneous synaptic signals, it is possible to apply some degree of intellectual control over it. It's not that you're entirely the passenger at the wheel once an event starts. Essentially, there is a threshold that you can, beyond which you're probably at the mercy of whatever's going to happen, but before which you do have a great deal of control over how far and how bad it's likely to get. If you can't manage to manage those circumstances, I find hospitals horrible places to be. They seem to trigger most of my fits. They're incredibly stressful. The lights are bright. The sounds and senses from the place are all pitched at such intensity that they're almost, I can imagine them being fairly overwhelming to the non-epileptic, but to the epileptic, and especially in the stressful conditions that usually accompany oneself having to go to hospital, then obviously you can see how this kind of would reach a threshold very, very suddenly, without the ability to kind of extract yourself from that situation. Obviously, you're in a hospital waiting room or sitting there waiting for a doc. There's not a great deal you can do about it. So in those situations, I tend to find that critical mass moment is reached at a much faster pace, and one's opportunities to head it off at the pass are very limited. And so substantially most of my because of the number of times that I've had to visit hospital A&Es over my lifespan, which is an alarming number of times for any adult individual. Surely I should have learnt my lesson. Have been accompanied by more than their fair share of fits, equally visiting relatives in hospital or just attending hospital generally. Dentists are another place, again, filled with stress hormones. But as soon as you walk into the place, the adrenaline-saturated air is just enough to put me into a spin straight away without my own anxiety about the place. So, crescendo, yeah, once that crescendo is passed, you need to get on the floor. And if you see anybody in this situation, don't do the old sticking a spoon in their bloody mouth to stop them swallowing their tongue. I don't think an epileptic has ever swallowed their tongue unless they happen to be bloody laying flat on their back and stoned out of their gourd on bloody booze and pills or something. Essentially, the noises that someone convulsing is making is not them swallowing their tongue. It's simply the uncoordinated efforts of their lung muscles to sustain an in and an out breath, which can't be done because both in and out signals are being sent at the same time. And this is essentially what happens, is that this torrent of synaptic flow, once it reaches the threshold, essentially starts to put in opposite nerve messages simultaneously. So you'll find a nerve that is generally allocated to distinguishing hot from cold will simultaneously tell you that you are both hot and cold. And it would appear that this is another part of the feedback loop, is that once you enter into this kind of duplex state, this kind of dipole state, that the brain loses its ability to actually make sense of its surroundings, that the inputs are so scattershot and so what's the word, contradictory, that it's impossible for the brain to make sense of its surroundings anymore. And I think that this is the point where essentially it switches off and you venture elsewhere. I'm not going to go into those realms today. I'm really not feeling up to giving my bold, brave adventures in the other realms. It can be an incredible place to visit. I have experienced the most amazing, incredible things in that realm. I don't believe that it's simply the realm of imagination. I've brought back facts from that place, solid, hard. You know what I mean? Bet on them, facts. Which would show that wherever it is that you go in fits, it isn't in. It appears to be out, the same as normal reality is. So, but anyway, the journey can be, you know what I mean, the voyage can be pleasant, it can be unpleasant. You know what I mean, there seems to be as many different lands and as many different emotions attached to that other side. And it's very much like waking from a dream. You have when you return to your senses, you have a fleeting recollection of what it was that just happened to you. And unless you actively remember what you have just experienced at the time, then it will be gone just the same as a dream will be from within a few minutes of waking. Yeah, what happens? Well, while you're not at home, your body is busy trying to stand up, sit down, lay down, jump up and down. It's trying to breathe in, it's trying to breathe out, the heart's trying to pump in, it's trying to pump out, and all of these it's trying to do simultaneously. And so as a result, your cardiovascular system goes into complete chaos. Blood's no longer delivered to your head, and this is the importance of the recovery position, that an epileptic will naturally regain consciousness from any fit that hasn't been interfered with by the outside world. The one time that I was seriously at risk of death during a fit was when I thought that I was going to be sick, was leaning over a toilet bowl and promptly had a fit, and because I went limp over the toilet bowl, my head hanging into the toilet prevented the return of blood flow in the natural order of things. And had I not been found in that state after about 3 minutes, I would probably not be here talking to you now. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much. I don't know where you are out there, but God, I wish I could find you. My dear friend Sharon. Okay, so while you're away, my God, your body in this ridiculous, contrary situation tears itself. It tears itself in the same way that one does a few milliseconds before impact with another car. The fraction of a second before your body hits the full extent of the seatbelt, every single muscle in your body is as tense as it has ever been. And then the flailing of your arms on top of that, any physical movement is what actually causes the damage, exactly the same as how whiplash is caused in a car accident. It's not the actual movement of the body, it's the movement of the body against such a powerful muscle response in resistance to that movement. So because the body is essentially trying to move in every direction, any actual physical force, any physical movement on that muscle is going to begin to tear and pull at the cells within it. So essentially you return to consciousness, and again, if you've managed to get yourself into the recovery position before you've gone unconscious, then most of this is going to be limited, and you're going to come back just a bit fuzzy-headed and wondering where the hell you've just been, and slightly concerned more about the people around you who generally look very white and alarmed at your kind of absence. But full tonic-clonic, my God. It really is like being in a car crash. And if you're having these things on a daily basis or a weekly basis or a monthly basis, you know what I mean, most of us only ever experience the injuries from a major car crash maybe once in our lives. But this, for fellow sufferers who have it worse than me, is just intolerable. The damage, the physical extremes, the extremities that this puts your body through, just leave you a tortured wreck as far as your musculature goes. So you come back into this body that's been trashed, that's been through the bloody wars, and it's not a pleasant place to be, and it doesn't work anymore. You try and get up and your legs won't lift you, you try and put an elbow under you, and you simply cannot coordinate the nerve stimulus that would normally appropriate that movement. This prolongs, you know what I mean, this can be anything from a few minutes to a couple of hours depending on the severity of the seizure. I was minded actually, I was talking about having had this recent fit to a friend on Skype, and I mentioned the fact that when my boy Charlie was born, the day that he was born was that incident where I fell unconscious down the toilet pan and was essentially rescued from that sort of moment of about as near to death as one can possibly come and still be here to tell the tale about it, to being led back into the delivery room the instant that I was able to find my feet and to be presented within about a matter of 5 minutes with my newborn firstborn son. So life and death in a very few minutes of one life, and I couldn't be unmoved by the significance and the implication of everywhere that I'd just been. I'm tired. I am very, very tired. I'm exhausted. I mean, I've been working for welfare stuff like a Trojan all week, trying to get podcasts and Weeblies and emails and YouTube sorted, as well as kind of joining in with the research, the management of the Skype room and such. Probably largely responsible for the state that I'm in at the minute. I'm going to fling a tune on and gather myself a little bit. God, my ears are whistling. I feel like I've just come from a Motorhead concert at the minute. Oh, blimey, was that only half an hour? Jesus, that felt like an age. Oh, let me find a long tune. Sorry, it's going to have to be something long, just arbitrarily, to give me as much time as possible. What we got there? We got Duo Infernale at 7 minutes 20. Oh, it's just going to have to be that one. Sorry, folks, I know I play this a lot, but this is Duo. Oh no, I'll just put on a couple. Bugger it. Just thanks to everyone in the chat box there for their words of support there. This is not the easiest of things in the world to do, and in fact that has actually made me feel a great deal better, which again illustrates the powerful psychosomatic kind of nature of epilepsy. It really does. It's an incredibly mind-driven illness, probably more so than any other. Sorry, slurping me lukewarm tea. Okay, right, I was going to sort of hedge on to causes and treatments, I suppose. Certainly, for me, one of the driving... I mean, just to say as well that somebody mentioned that I think it was their sister-in-law, used to suffer from epilepsy and has now recovered to some degree. And that this can happen. I mean, certainly I spent 17 years without a major grand mal seizure and will quite easily go, 1 year to the next without anything. Had a few for the last sort of 2 or 3 years, but largely circumstantial rather than necessarily driven by any great resurgence of the main larger kind of symptomology of epilepsy. One thing I might mention here as well is the kind of range of symptomology as well. Most people think of epilepsy as just being this thing where you fall to the ground and flap around like a landed fish, which is certainly a fairly accurate description of a tonic-clonic or grand mal seizure. This is the extremity, though. This is the far extremity of a complete range of neurological symptoms. These can range from the psychological to the purely neurological. For me, other than the grand mal seizures, largely it's petit mals, these little fits, where essentially you lose consciousness, you find yourself somewhere else for a moment, and then I return to the room without having left your seat. And these can, you can find yourself sort of flitting in and out of various realities. And this can be very, very distracting, almost impossible to carry out a conversation. People look at you like you're completely mad because you're responding to a part of their conversation that may have been 2 sentences ago while having ignored the 2 sentences in between because you weren't there. They're looking at you as far as they're concerned. You're sitting there, you're looking at them. You may have glazed over a little and they may not have noticed that, but essentially you're still in the room with them. But you're not, mentally you're not there. So there's these petit mals. You also have shorter petit mals that are described as absences. This will just simply be like the duration of a blink, perhaps. Where you're just simply otherwise occupied. And again, I suppose that these are all these kind of precursors. These are these erroneous neurological signals. The synapses firing when there's no, when there's no stimulus, or simply responding with an inappropriate level of amplification for a stimulus. Because this is another thing that most people don't understand, is that their senses are constantly filtered, and the amplification applied to that nerve input into the brain is adjusted and amplified. One of the reasons I think for the whistling in the ears is because the inner ear actually contains a muscle layer that's separated from the little hairs that detect movement and noise, and this little muscle layer essentially attenuates the ear, acts as an amplifier or defeat unit, so it either turns up the volume or turns it down. This is why our ears tend to become very acute in quiet circumstances, and yet we can still go and stand at the airport and listen to the planes take off. as far as kind of eyes and things, obviously you have the autonomic response of the irises closing up to respond to the level of light input, but these are all kind of physiological responses to differing levels of sensory input from the outside world. This is what I'm talking about more is a how can I describe it? That the nerves at your skin are constantly detecting temperature, they are constantly detecting sensation, they are constantly detecting the texture of your clothes, the warmth of the air, all sorts of parameters are measured by them, and these are normally fed into the brain into a constantly carefully metered flow, so that no one part of the body places an overburden on the processing capacity of the brain. Well, essentially, as soon as at the onset of a fit, this capacity to monitor and to reduce the level of amplification on that nerve signal becomes interfered with, and so this is like I say, we tend to get as a precursor to fits wet sensations, hot sensations, pins and needles. But also there's again this kind of range of sensation from, the extremity that you may experience just before going unconscious during a grand mal to, personally I get stuck with pins. That's my personal bane of my life, is that when I'm laying down to go to sleep at night, I am stuck with pins. It's exactly like somebody creeping up to the bed and sticking a sewing pin in you somewhere, usually in some soft tissue place in the kind of ball of your foot, in the crook of your knee, in your groin. I don't know why the soft tissues, maybe I suppose that the nerve groupings there are closer together, so they tend to be sensitive areas because of the density of the nerve endings. So perhaps it's just simply a statistical thing, and we're talking about random sporadic firings. I'm slightly suspicious that some of that may be nerve repair. I know that a doctor will tell you that nerves do not repair. It's bullshit. Nerves do repair. They take about 7 years. They don't repair fully. You don't get full sensation back. But essentially most nerve signals from the body to the brain will be rerouted via a suitable transmission route, even if it has to bypass an area of damage. But because I, as I openly admit, spent a large portion of my adult life as a drink and drugs abuser, narcotics specifically, the doctors, when I became sober, were amazed that I hadn't appeared to have incurred any level of liver or hepatic infunction. So I hadn't fucked up my liver and kidneys, God knows how. And that they appeared that any nerve damage was undetectable, but I suspect that at the time I was still somewhat under the sedative properties of some of the drugs that I'd been using. Some of their long-term effects are incredibly long-lasting, and in fact, yes, as a consequence of my heavy consumption of drink and narcotics, I had induced some level of systemic damage on the bindings to the outside of the nerves. So some of what I'm suffering now may simply be nerve endings that haven't sent a signal for years because of the sustained abuse that they suffered, that are now finally waking up and going, hello, I'm awake. And because nobody's been listening for so long, they don't know how loud to shout. So I know that I used to experience that before I ever took any narcotics or drank heavily. So I know that it is definitely one of the kind of neurological effects of epilepsy sufferers, to have this kind of fibromyalgic response, which is essentially an anathemic nerve response, an unprovoked nerve response, and it literally feels like I'm being stuck with sewing pins. I actually have to put my hand, I have to touch the area of skin affected so as to convince the nerve that there isn't actually a pin poking in it. You have to sort of connect the lack of damage in your brain via another nerve. So, I mean, touching it with your finger sort of makes that kind of, oh, right, there's this nerve signal coming from here, and it's saying this thing, and this hand is saying, oh, no, and there's loads more nerves saying, oh, no, so it kind of overrides and writes off that signal. Again, in this fabulous, the human neurology is an incredible machine. You know, we look at the internet and marvel at it, but blimey, nature really did an incredible job on us. I mean, the level and sophistication of our senses is just beyond all belief. And again, that we really, without exercising, most of our senses are actually dulled to a blunt blade when they should be a surgical instrument. Again, many of the martial arts, if you kind of practice martial arts, you'll often bring your senses into a sharp focus, much the same as an engineer's eyesight or a musician's ears. And again, if you can imagine extrapolating that out to all of the senses, if we could raise our levels of awareness to a perpetual state of those sort of heightened senses, I wonder what our experience of the world might be like. Right. Oh, okay. Is Janice about? Is she? All right. Okay. Let me just, Steve. Can you just hold on? Let me just have a look here. Right. I still can't see a contact. Oh yeah. Right. Okay. I've got that now. All right. 1 second. Right. Okay. Steve, can you just let her know that I'll be ready in about 15 minutes? I just want to go into. I just want to cover medicinal herbs, medicinal cannabis. So let's just go there, and then I'll bring Janice on. I know I was lined up to have Janice on the show, but she hadn't returned my contact request, so I'd assumed that she was unable to join me. No, this is Janice Barcelo of the Armacht. Mind control victim site, assistant site. I don't know quite what you describe it as. I'm sure she'll say it better than I can. So I've found that essentially alcohol is a huge trigger for fits. The sugar rushes and crashes that you get as a heavy alcohol consumer will actually trigger fits in somebody that doesn't normally have them. Often in the midst of the alcohol stupor, so one may not even remember having them the night before, but they are as equally as dangerous, even for the non-epileptic, as they are. And again, we see this kind of interference on a neurological level. And anything that interferes rather than enhances on a neurological level, so most of the narcotics, alcohol, probably to some extent nicotine and caffeine, are probably best avoided if you want to avoid these kind of symptoms. However, I want to go on the medicinal use of cannabis. I have joked here many times on my various shows about my vast consumption of cannabis, but really it is no laughing matter. Essentially, once I came across cannabis in my early teens, I realised almost immediately that it was the jigsaw piece that fit my puzzle. It completed me somehow. It gave me the ability to meter the amount of experience, the dearth of experience that as an epileptic is the thing that you largely try and control, the extremities of sensation. And while the actual experience, the psychedelic part of the experience, may be an additional sensation, it's not in any way usually one that is in any sense overwhelming. It's usually a very meditative sensation, and so it's a counterpoint to the chaotic, sporadic firing of the synapses that accompanies the kind of epileptic. I have heard that Scarlet Pimpernel can be used as a herbal remedy with epileptics, I dare you to go and try and find some, because if you find some one day, it won't be there the next. They seek him here, they seek him here, they seek that Scarlet Pimpernel everywhere. Never a truer word said. Trying to find that stuff in the bloody wild is a nightmare. Very easy to identify, but incredibly risky to use. I would recommend most people leave it well alone. The LD50, the dose at which 50% of the population would be killed, is incredibly near to the actual effective dose. Now, having not experienced it, I don't know whether you would simply build up from a lower dose and acquire a tolerance in order to be able to take the effective dose safely. Certainly that would be the case with pharmaceuticals, so I don't see any reason why you can't apply that rationale to herbal medicine. But as far as I'm aware, it's a heavy narcotic in its effect. Hypnotic, in fact, is how it's described, which would effectively mean it's very sedating, probably very similar in effect to the opiates, the morphines, or the kind of Valium-like sedatives. Valerian you can use. Valerian, personally, I find very distasteful and would only use in absolute emergencies. It's essentially the herb which Valium is extracted from. It's very safe, largely in its herbal form, very sedative, almost identical in its effect to Valium. But unfortunately it permeates the body with the taste of valerian, and you'll taste nothing but valerian for weeks afterwards. If you happen to like the taste of valerian, I suppose that's not such a bad thing. I once had a cat that was absolutely fucking mad about the stuff and would routinely split the bag and spread it all out all over the settee, and you come back with the cat lying on his back in a big pool of valerian powder with his eyes rolling around at his head. That didn't seem to matter what cupboard we put it in as well. He would actually seek the stuff out. He was totally into it. So yeah, cannabis has been the only real kind of anchor for me. And the only consequence with this is that, again, cannabis has a huge direct causal link with blood sugar levels, and the infrequent use of cannabis in large doses is probably very hazardous to an epileptic. And certainly I would advise anybody that I knew that had fits to avoid, hitting the bong straight after a period of sobriety. And certainly if they had any alcohol in their system, I would tell them just bloody don't do it. Yeah, and essentially what we see here is the need to maintain, to achieve an effective maintenance dose. And that's essentially what you hear me doing at the microphone, is I essentially imbibe cannabis joints from sun up to sundown in a fairly consistent stream. And as a result, my blood sugar levels are more or less regulated by its consistency and by my constant application of hot sweet tea, which I use as a kind of ballast. Again, I don't know how much of this I would advise anybody else to attempt. I've kind of stumbled into it a bit blindly and through trial and error, and there has been lots of error, found my way to an effective level of treatment that suits me in my sort of lifestyle choices. I don't know that it would necessarily suit anybody else. One thing I would like to just quickly cover here is that in that medicinal marijuana, medicinal cannabis, we've started to describe cannabis as two different types. You can either get gangster or you can get righteous. Anything that you buy off a street corner, anything that comes through the commercial cannabis supply routes is essentially regarded as gangster. At some point on its production and transmission route, somebody will have been injured or disadvantaged through its supply and production, whether that be from the poor Koreans who are sitting in the squatted house on the stolen electricity, where the gangs have taken their passports and are withholding them for debts to the triads to cover their illegal importation into the country, or whether that be the poor teenage street lad who gets involved in crime because it's the only way in his area to make a bob or two as a 16-year-old. So if you are going to try cannabis, please make sure that you make the contacts with other people who are growing righteous cannabis, that they're growing it organically, that they're growing it with a mind to quality rather than quantity, and that you can be absolutely certain that nobody was injured or disadvantaged in its production or transmission and supply. That's about all I've got to say on that. Right, okay, I'm going to throw a tune on and see if Janice is ready to come on the show with me. I'll have to leave my introduction. I may even try and put her off, to be quite honest. My brain is so addled, I really don't know whether I can take this subject and do it justice. Maybe Steve. Steve's having internet problems as well, isn't he? Oh, I'll throw on a couple and I'll see what... I'm pretty much done with this subject, so I'm going to see what can and can't be achieved tonight and take it from there, I suppose. So here's a bit of Burning Spear and Garvey's Ghost for you in the meantime.
He goes away from Africa with the intention to steal our culture. The good Father passed by and said, humble yourself, my children. Humble yourself, my little one. Humble yourself.